On October 29, 1962, at 3:15 p.m., pale sunlight slipped through the tall seminar room windows at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, turning chalk dust into a thin white haze that drifted above the long wooden table. Professor Harold McKee stood beside a stack of student papers, the faint smell of old paper and cold radiator metal filling the room. His hands moved steadily through the essays until one set of figures stopped him mid-breath. The data in front of him carried the crisp clarity of internal Soviet planning documents, the kind he had seen years earlier during a brief government consultancy he never discussed with students. He glanced toward the far corner where Leonard Fisher sat, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the floor as if waiting for something he couldn't name. McKee approached him with the paper folded in his hand, the floorboards creaking softly under each step. Fisher looked up as the professor stopped beside his desk, and the stale classroom air felt briefly heavier. McKee asked a simple, routine question about the source of a specific Soviet production statistic. His tone mild, but his attention sharpened. Fisher's answer arrived in fragments. His voice wavered, offering a vague reference to a journal article no one on campus had access to, and his fingers tightened around the edge of his notebook, leaving faint marks on the paper. McKee noticed the tremor, a small vibration that carried more meaning than the words themselves. Outside, students passed along the hallway, their footsteps muffled behind the door, creating a soft, rhythmic pulse that contrasted sharply with Fisher's growing agitation. The professor pressed lightly, adjusting his glasses as he requested the precise publication date. Fisher swallowed hard, the movement visible in the fluorescent light that flickered occasionally above them. He shifted in his seat, producing a faint scrape of wood against the floor, and offered a second answer that contradicted the first. McKee, who rarely lost composure, felt a twinge of unease settle across his shoulders as he sensed the gap widening between Fisher's claims and the physical reality of the documents. A gust of cold air seeped beneath the door and carried with it the familiar scent of autumn leaves from the courtyard, sharpening the edges of the moment. Fisher looked away toward the window, his breathing shallow, as though calculating the cost of every additional sentence. McKee sensed the conversation had reached a point where randomness no longer explained the contradictions. The details were too precise, too closely aligned with materials that never circulated outside classified channels. The room fell still. Even the hum of the radiator seemed to retreat, leaving a thin, tense silence that framed the final exchange. Fisher nodded stiffly when McKee asked to review his research notes next class, though his eyes carried a fleeting flicker of dread that vanished as quickly as it appeared. McKee walked back to his desk with the paper held firmly in one hand, aware that the moment had shifted something fundamental. He slid the essay into his briefcase, feeling the weight of it settle like a stone against the leather bottom. The decision to examine it again after office hours pressed against his thoughts, forming a quiet certainty he could not yet articulate. Outside, the afternoon sky dimmed to a muted gray as the campus prepared for evening, unaware that a small exchange in a quiet room had already begun unraveling a hidden life. And the consequences, though distant, had already taken shape. By early November 1962, Madison carried the sharp scent of wood smoke drifting from student apartments, and the brittle rustle of fallen leaves scraped along the sidewalks outside Bascom Hall. Leonard Fisher moved through this environment with controlled precision, never rushing, never lingering, his steps steady as he crossed the campus each morning. He lived in a narrow, sparsely furnished apartment above a bakery on State Street, where the warm smell of rising dough seeped through the floorboards before sunrise. His days unfolded in predictable sequences: library research at dawn, assistant ship duties at noon, evening seminars until well after the sky turned a deep winter blue. He maintained polite but guarded relationships with classmates, offering short greetings in hallways and well-rehearsed comments during group discussions. The rhythm of academic life suited him. It demanded structure, which he supplied in rigid proportions. He wore the same charcoal overcoat every day, its fabric worn smooth at the sleeves from constant use, and he carried a leather satchel that never left his sight, even during short trips to the cafeteria. Inside the bag were notebooks filled with immaculate handwriting, each line straight, each number carefully circled or underlined. Fisher rented the apartment's smallest room for sleep, preferring dim light from a single lamp to the harsher glare of overhead bulbs. The radiator clanked every evening, producing a steady metallic rhythm that masked the sounds of footsteps in the hallway. He kept no personal decorations on the walls, except a faded map of Europe pinned above his desk. He studied it often, tracing borders with the tip of his finger, pausing longest over the territories east of Berlin. To neighbors, he appeared courteous but distant. The bakery owner described him as dependable, always greeting with a quiet nod before ordering plain coffee and a single roll. Students in his study groups noticed how rarely he spoke about his past, deflecting questions with vague references to distant relatives or childhood moves. His accent, barely perceptible, surfaced only when he spoke quickly, then vanished as soon as he regained composure. The university itself operated under the same Cold War tension that gripped the nation, though its corridors tried to preserve an illusion of calm. Bulletin boards displayed announcements for lectures on Soviet economics, nuclear deterrence, and ideological rivalry, their edges yellowing under layers of thumbtacks. Faculty who had previously consulted for federal agencies maintained a quiet vigilance, aware that academic spaces often drew attention from foreign intelligence services seeking information under the cover of research. Most students ignored such concerns, but a few professors, McKee among them, recognized subtle patterns when they appeared. Fisher moved through these surroundings as though built to avoid scrutiny. He submitted assignments early, answered questions precisely, and never drew more attention than necessary. Yet beneath his well-managed exterior, small details hinted at a life out of rhythm with those around him. He never invited classmates to his apartment, declined social events with polite excuses, and rarely displayed spontaneous emotion. He handled campus discussions of Soviet policy with an almost clinical detachment, as if weighing each word for hidden consequences. The routines made him appear stable, even predictable, but the consistency itself carried a rigid quality that left certain observers slightly unsettled. Everything he did fit so neatly inside expected patterns that the absence of imperfection became its own warning signal. And while the world beyond the university braced for the final tremors of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Fisher's carefully maintained life continued to move along narrow tracks, unaware that a single question in a quiet seminar room had already begun tightening its boundaries. A normal life persisted on the surface, but Fisher's had already formed beneath it. On November 3, 1962, the first snow of the season drifted across the Wisconsin campus, leaving thin white strands on the stone steps outside the Humanities building. Professor McKee walked through the corridor carrying Leonard Fisher's latest submission, its pages smooth but unnervingly dense with figures that gleamed under fluorescent light like tiny signals. The scent of wet wool from passing students mingled with the dry chemical smell of mimeographed lecture notes, creating a sharp tension in the air. McKee's pace quickened as he reached his office, the sound of his shoes echoing along the narrow hallway. Inside, he closed the door with a soft click and laid the paper flat across his desk. He scanned the lines again, tracing a table of Soviet industrial allocations too current to be found in accessible libraries. The numbers resembled projections he had seen only in confidential briefings a decade earlier, memories he usually kept buried beneath layers of routine academic life. A faint pulse of unease tightened around his ribs as he circled the suspicious data with a red pencil, its waxy scent rising with each stroke. His fingers trembled slightly, enough for him to notice. He reached for a reference manual on his shelf, flipping through brittle pages until he located the nearest public approximation of Fisher's figures. The discrepancies were small but precise, the kind that indicated access to restricted sources rather than exceptional guesswork. McKee exhaled slowly, hearing the radiator hiss behind him like a warning he had tried to ignore. Later that afternoon, he sought out Professor Marlin, a colleague in international studies known for his cautious instincts. They spoke in a dim faculty lounge where the air smelled of burnt coffee and chalk dust. McKee handed him the paper, watching the older man's eyebrows rise as he moved down the columns. Marlin said little, but the tightening of his jaw confirmed McKee's early suspicion. The student was either fabricating numbers with uncanny accuracy or obtaining them from channels far beyond academic research. When McKee returned to his office, he began documenting dates and details in a small leather notebook he normally used for lecture outlines. The act steadied him. He listed Fisher's unusual hesitations, the shifting explanations, the exact sentences that had seemed harmless until now. Each entry sharpened the feeling that he had stepped into a situation he could not treat as a mere academic irregularity. At home that evening, McKee spread his documents across the dining table, the lamplight carving pale rectangles across the paper. Snow continued falling outside, muting the city and pressing a quiet urgency into the room. He compared Fisher's work with internal files he still kept locked in his filing cabinet, notes he had retained from his consultancy days, intending someday to use them in a book. The parallels were unmistakable. Fisher knew things he had no plausible path to knowing. As the night thickened, McKee recognized the shape of his own fear, the dread of being correct. The Cold War had turned scholars into reluctant gatekeepers, and he had hoped never to face a moment where that vigilance became personal. Yet the evidence forming before him left little room for doubt. The investigation was no longer academic. It was a necessary act of protection. By the time the clock neared midnight, McKee closed the folder and placed it gently at the center of the table. The crumpled tension in his chest had hardened into something sharper. He understood that the next step would demand caution, accuracy, and an unflinching record of everything that followed. The quiet suspicion had become something heavier, and it was already gathering momentum. On November 14, 1962, a low gray sky pressed against the windows of the third-floor seminar room, dimming the light until the overhead bulbs hummed with a faint electric buzz. The air carried the scent of damp coats and freshly sharpened pencils as students gathered their materials at the end of the session. Fisher moved quickly, shuffling notebooks into his satchel with a precision that bordered on urgency. His hands trembled just enough for McKee to notice from across the room. A moment later, the satchel slipped from Fisher's shoulder, landing with a dull thud that sent loose pages scattering across the floor. The sound cracked sharply through the room, drawing brief glances from students preparing to leave. Fisher crouched to gather the papers, but McKee had already reached him, the faint rubber smell of the classroom's eraser trays drifting between them. Fisher muttered a quiet thanks and backed away, leaving a few sheets beneath a nearby chair in his hurry to exit. When the door closed behind the last student, a heavy stillness settled over the room. McKee bent to retrieve the forgotten pages, feeling the coarse texture of cheap paper against his fingertips. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the first sheet, tight, careful handwriting filled with ratios and production targets identical to a restricted briefing he had once reviewed under federal supervision. The next page held even sharper detail, abbreviations used internally by Soviet ministries, markings almost impossible for an outsider to replicate without direct exposure. He carried the pages to his desk, the fluorescent light flickering above him like a restless pulse. Outside, the hallway grew quiet except for the distant hum of a janitor's floor buffer. McKee aligned the notes beside the earlier suspicious submissions, their similarities forming a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Several numbers appeared in sequence across different documents, a signature of access rather than speculation. A thin chill crept through the room as he examined a small hand-drawn table showing military-related production flows. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, releasing a faint chemical smell, as if the pen used had been of foreign manufacture. That detail, minor yet disturbing, tightened the knot in his stomach. The realization broke cleanly through the remaining doubt. Fisher possessed information that should not exist in an academic environment. McKee opened his desk drawer and removed a locked file box containing remnants of his old consultancy materials. He hesitated only a moment before spreading classified-level summaries beside Fisher's notes, aligning them by category. The match was unmistakable. Some figures were identical. Others were updated versions of earlier projections, accurate enough to suggest ongoing access to current Soviet intelligence streams. He stepped back from the desk, breath unsteady, as the fluorescent light buzzed harder overhead. His pulse thudded in his ears, competing with the radiator's metallic clicking. The room's walls, normally a blank comfort, seemed to press closer around him. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The student he had quietly trusted for months was operating behind an identity he had never questioned. A gust of cold air seeped through the window frame, brushing the papers like a warning. McKee gathered them into a single pile, though his hand shook with the weight of what he now held. This was no longer suspicion. It was proof, and it left him standing at the very edge of a decision he could no longer avoid. That night, November 14th, 1962, cold wind rattled the windows of McKee's home, carrying the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke through the narrow cracks in the frame. He spread Fisher's documents across the kitchen table, their edges curling slightly under the warm lamplight. The wood grain beneath them felt rough against his palms, grounding him as he tried to steady his thoughts. Every page whispered the same truth, yet he struggled to accept the enormity of what he had uncovered. He poured a cup of black coffee, its bitterness rising sharply as steam fogged the inside of his glasses. The familiar taste offered no comfort. Each sip only deepened the tension in his chest. If he reported Fisher and the suspicion proved wrong, he risked destroying a student's future and his own integrity. If he remained silent and the information reached hostile hands, he would become complicit in a failure he could never undo. The dilemma pressed against him like a tightening vice. McKee pulled a notepad closer, intending to list the options with clinical objectivity, but the pen hesitated between his fingers. Memories from his brief government work returned in unwanted detail. Conference rooms where analysts whispered about Soviet infiltration attempts, files describing cover identities constructed with ruthless precision, warnings that universities offered fertile ground for hidden recruits. The echoes of those briefings now intersected with Fisher's calm demeanor, turning ordinary moments into dangerous symbols. Outside, a police siren drifted faintly through the night, rising and falling like a distant alarm. The sound unsettled him, sharpening the urgency he had been trying to suppress. He pushed back from the table, pacing slowly across the linoleum floor. The kitchen light flickered once, casting a wavering shadow across Fisher's papers, as if marking the thin boundary between doubt and action. He rested both hands on the back of a chair, the wood cool beneath his fingers. The university's reputation flashed through his mind. Faculty scrutiny, administrative backlash, students questioning motives, but these concerns felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the potential risk. He considered speaking to Fisher directly, imagining the student's expression shifting from confusion to fear, yet the scenario collapsed under its own danger. Direct confrontation would warn him, and once warned, he could disappear. McKee sank into the chair and forced himself to breathe through the tightening in his throat. He pictured the classified figures Fisher had somehow accessed, the accuracy too precise to dismiss. He imagined those numbers traveling across borders, carried through coded channels to analysts who would dissect them with cold efficiency. The idea unsettled him more deeply than he expected. The documents on his table no longer looked like student notes. They looked like pieces of a larger, hidden machinery. The coffee had cooled, leaving an acrid scent that mingled with the paper's musty smell. McKee reached for a blank envelope, sliding several of the most incriminating sheets inside. The decision took shape with slow finality, rising from fear into obligation. He would document everything carefully, providing a clear record while protecting the university from unnecessary exposure. The consequences, whatever they became, would follow in their own time. He sealed the envelope, feeling a brief tremor run through his hand as the adhesive snapped into place. Outside, the wind struck the house again, rattling the glass with steady insistence. He placed the envelope beside his briefcase, aware that once the morning came, there would be no reversing the path he had chosen. What remained was simply to follow it. On November 22, 1962, thin sunlight washed across campus rooftops as a crisp wind carried the scent of cold metal and freshly fallen snow through the university courtyard. Professor McKee walked toward his office with steady steps, the sealed envelope hidden beneath folders in his briefcase. His pulse thudded with a restrained urgency he forced himself to conceal. Inside the administration building, the air smelled faintly of floor polish and damp wool coats hung near the entrance, creating a sterile tension that sharpened every sound. At 9:40 a.m., two men in dark overcoats approached him in the corridor outside his office. Their movements were deliberate, their presence controlled, as though they had rehearsed every detail of the moment. They introduced themselves quietly, special agents from the Milwaukee field office, sent under expedited authority after receiving McKee's confidential memo. Their low voices blended with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, forming an atmosphere that felt both official and unnervingly quiet. McKee handed over the envelope, its weight suddenly heavier in his grip. The agents opened it in silence, studying each page as though assembling a puzzle with dangerous edges. One of them nodded once, curt and impersonal, before instructing McKee to remain available throughout the day. The other checked his watch, the metallic click of the clasp echoing softly against the hallway walls. They moved with calculated purpose toward the political science wing, where Fisher's morning schedule placed him in a faculty consultation session. Their shoes tapped steadily against the tile floor, each step building toward an invisible line Fisher did not know he had crossed. Meanwhile, two additional agents entered the main administrative office, requesting authorization for an apartment search under a sealed federal warrant. A gray folder slid across the counter, thick with legal forms and procedural notes. The ink scent rising from the paperwork mingled with the dry aroma of typewriter ribbons, creating a tangible reminder of what was now unfolding beyond the campus's calm exterior. Vehicles idled discreetly outside, engines humming beneath the cold air. Inside a small meeting room, Fisher waited with a notebook open in front of him. The window behind him cast narrow strips of winter light across the desk, illuminating dust particles suspended like tiny frozen sparks. When the agents entered, the temperature seemed to drop a degree. Fisher's eyes flickered to the visitors' badges, and a subtle tension tightened his shoulders. They invited him to speak about his research methods, asking routine questions delivered with meticulous neutrality. Minutes passed, each one tightening the pressure in the room. Fisher's answers shifted, his gaze wandering to the window before snapping back to the table. His fingers tapped twice against the notebook, producing small, uneven taps that betrayed his attempt to remain calm. One agent placed Fisher's earlier notes in front of him, positioning them with slow precision. The paper rustled softly as Fisher exhaled through clenched teeth. Across town, agents entered his apartment. The door opened with a quick metallic snap, the lock surrendering to authorized hands. The interior smelled of stale coffee and laundry soap, a lived-in space stripped of warmth. They moved methodically through the rooms, opening drawers and cabinets with controlled efficiency. In a battered desk, they found a false bottom containing microfilm, coded notebooks, and a passport under a different name. The discovery formed a silent verdict that required no further interpretation. Back on campus, the agent closest to Fisher received a brief radio signal through a concealed transmitter. The faint static broke the silence. Fisher noticed the shift, just a flicker of tightening posture, and his expression changed, tension rising like a shadow across his face. The agent closed Fisher's notebook and slid it aside with deliberate calm. The moment of confrontation arrived without raised voices or sudden movements. Fisher realized the truth before anyone spoke it. His breathing hitched, and the faint smell of cold air from the hallway slipped into the room as the agents positioned themselves between him and the door. The operation moved with finality. The facade around him collapsed in a single, stark silence. The news of Fisher's detention never reached the campus in any official form. On the morning of November 23, 1962, the university corridors moved with their usual clatter of footsteps and muffled conversations, unaware that federal investigators had already taken a student from the premises. A cold draft swept through the administrative building, carrying the faint smell of wet wool and newsprint as staff arrived for work. Only a handful of senior officials had been informed, and even they received sparse, carefully filtered details. In a windowless interrogation room several miles away, Fisher sat beneath a harsh ceiling lamp that hummed softly against the metallic fixtures. The air felt dry, almost sterile, as if scrubbed of anything that might distract from the seriousness of the moment. Agents placed his confiscated notebooks on the table, their edges aligned with deliberate precision. Fisher kept his gaze fixed on the blank surface, refusing to look at the items that had undone his carefully constructed life. The questioning began quietly. Each inquiry carried a calm, procedural tone, yet the weight behind every word pressed deeper than the one before it. Documents slid across the table with a soft scrape, revealing coded annotations, timelines, and references unmistakably tied to classified Soviet materials. Fisher's posture stiffened under the rising tension, his breath growing shallow as he realized how little room remained for denial. The smell of ink and worn paper filled the space, growing sharper as agents turned page after page. Back on campus, the vacuum left by Fisher's disappearance created small ripples among those who knew him. A few classmates asked each other about his absence, assuming illness or a sudden family emergency. Their guesses faded into routine by midday, swallowed by lectures and academic deadlines. The university issued no statement. Administrators had already received instructions to refer any inquiries to a general notice about an unexpected leave of absence, a phrase that blended seamlessly into the cautious culture of Cold War-era institutions. Meanwhile, Fisher's apartment became a sealed evidence site. Agents cataloged each item with meticulous care. The faint odor of photochemicals on a handkerchief, the dusty residue near the desk where the false compartment had been discovered, the slight indentation on the floorboards where the satchel had rested nightly. Every detail added another layer of certainty. What had begun as a professor's quiet observation was now a full federal case, moving quickly through channels accustomed to secrecy. McKee spent the day teaching as usual, though the steady rhythm of chalk against the blackboard felt strangely detached. The fluorescent lights above his classroom flickered at intervals, leaving brief shadows across the walls. He noticed the change in himself, the subtle tightening in his shoulders, the way his thoughts wandered to the envelope he had handed over. The responsibility sat heavy in his mind, yet he maintained a steady voice, careful to keep the day from slipping into suspicion among students. Late that afternoon, an agent contacted him to confirm additional details about the timeline of events. The call was brief and direct, the tone professional but unmistakably final. McKee provided the information, hearing the quiet tap of typewriter keys in the background as the agent recorded his statements. When the conversation ended, the silence in his office felt thick enough to touch. In the interrogation room, Fisher finally spoke. His voice cracked slightly, strained from the hours of controlled stillness. He denied intentional wrongdoing, offering explanations that dissolved under the weight of presented evidence. The agents remained unfazed, pressing steadily forward, their questions narrowing with each passing minute. Outside, twilight settled over the city. Streetlights flickered on, casting long orange reflections across wet pavement. The day's events had already begun disappearing behind layers of official secrecy, leaving only the quiet hum of classified machinery turning in the background. The consequences had arrived, cold and irreversible, and they would continue unfolding long after the campus returned to its ordinary rhythm. In the spring of 1963, snowmelt carved thin, muddy channels through the edges of Madison's streets, while the Fisher case disappeared behind sealed files and locked cabinets within the federal system. His name no longer appeared on university rosters, and his former classmates moved forward without realizing how thoroughly he had been erased. Only a few administrators retained fragments of the incident, tucked into confidential correspondence that smelled faintly of old glue and carbon paper. The silence surrounding the case thickened over the following months, becoming its own form of containment. Inside a federal facility several hundred miles away, Fisher lived under a controlled routine that left little room for reflection. The hallways echoed with the hollow clack of guards' boots, and the cells carried a faint metallic odor that never fully faded. His days rotated through interviews, document reviews, and sessions where analysts probed every aspect of his past. They asked for details about recruitment, training, and methods of communication. His answers remained measured but incomplete, revealing enough to confirm the breadth of his activities while concealing areas he refused to expose. Each session concluded with a sterile click of a tape recorder shutting off. By mid-1964, the investigation shifted from extraction to containment. Fisher's materials had been dispersed among multiple agencies, each analyzing a different layer of his activities. Reports arrived in sealed envelopes marked with red stamps indicating restricted circulation. Analysts compared handwriting samples, cross-referenced coded entries, and reconstructed timelines using the faint pencil marks left on maps recovered from his desk. They found no direct link to other operatives on campus, yet the lingering uncertainty forced broader reviews across academic institutions nationwide. Meanwhile, the professor who had initiated the inquiry continued teaching in relative quiet. McKee maintained his routine: early lectures, afternoon seminars, and evenings spent grading in his dimly lit office. Yet the memory of the envelope he had delivered stayed with him, surfacing whenever campus discussions touched on ideology or global strategy. Students noticed the subtle change in his demeanor: slightly tighter pauses, a lingering look when someone referenced foreign policy, but no one connected it to anything beyond the strain of the era. The tension of the Cold War had become a constant backdrop, pressing into every classroom discussion. During this period, federal agencies quietly adjusted their approach to academic environments. Training manuals were updated to include new warning signs, referencing anonymous cases drawn from situations like Fisher's. Instructor briefings emphasized vigilance, advising faculty to note unusual patterns in research behavior. The directives circulated discreetly, leaving a faint scent of mimeograph ink on every page. Universities, caught between openness and caution, implemented modest procedural changes that reshaped the handling of sensitive international materials. Fisher's confinement stretched into the decade, marked by routine transfers between secure facilities. He adapted to the shifting environments with a rigid calm, speaking only when necessary and maintaining the same disciplined posture he once displayed on campus. Guards described him as quiet and methodical, neither hostile nor cooperative. His expression rarely changed, even when confronted with evidence that contradicted his statements. The controlled atmosphere around him reinforced the boundaries of a life that no longer resembled the identity he had once worn so convincingly. Outside the walls of the institutions holding him, the world moved through crises and diplomatic standoffs. Headlines carried new tensions: missile deployments, proxy conflicts, ideological confrontations, but none referenced the anonymous student whose case had contributed to a subtle shift in federal vigilance. Fisher's story remained invisible, sealed behind classification codes that prevented disclosure. Even his name faded in official correspondence, replaced by case numbers that reduced his existence to a line on a report. Years passed, leaving thin sediment layers of secrecy over the incident. Those who had been directly involved continued their lives, carrying the memory like a quiet landmark they avoided returning to. The machinery of intelligence work absorbed Fisher's file, transforming it from an active case into a reference point buried within training materials. The consequences of that winter discovery kept unfolding, even as time pushed the story deeper into shadows where it would remain for decades. In the early 1970s, the federal records facility that housed Fisher's case files smelled of cardboard, dust, and the faint chemical tang of aging microfilm. His dossier, once circulated among multiple agencies, now rested in a climate-controlled cabinet marked with a fading classification label. Analysts who reviewed Cold War espionage cases occasionally pulled it for reference, tracing the margins where his coded notations had been preserved under glass. The details remained intact, yet the man behind them had almost vanished from institutional memory. By 1974, Fisher had been relocated under a program designed for long-term containment of compromised foreign assets. The transfer occurred quietly, conducted at night through a series of unmarked vehicles that moved with practiced efficiency. He entered a facility farther from public view, where the air carried a constant disinfectant odor and fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across polished floors. Guards described him as calm, detached, and unchanging, his routines so precise they resembled a mechanical pattern rather than human habit. Conversations with staff rarely extended beyond brief acknowledgments. Meanwhile, McKee approached retirement age. His lectures retained their clarity, but the experience with Fisher remained a quiet thread running beneath years of academic work. The memory surfaced unexpectedly at times, during discussions of Soviet strategy, while grading a paper containing unusually sharp insights, or when passing a student who carried the same type of worn leather satchel Fisher once held. He never spoke of the incident, though the tension it had introduced into his career never entirely dissolved. He kept the desk drawer containing his remaining notes locked until the day he cleared his office. The 1980s brought new waves of espionage cases, drawing public attention toward more notorious operatives. Fisher's story, still classified, became overshadowed by arrests and defections that filled headlines with sharper intrigue. Inside federal archives, his name shifted from active file to historical artifact, labeled for eventual review once security thresholds were met. Analysts who encountered the case noted its unusual origin: a university paper, a single question, and a chain of evidence rooted in academic scrutiny rather than field surveillance. Fisher aged within the system, his once steady posture gradually bowing under the weight of time. Years of confinement left subtle marks: slight tremors in his hands, slower steps across the polished concrete, a growing silence that deepened with each passing season. Yet he never fully disclosed the operational network that had brought him to the United States. Investigators concluded that his knowledge had been compartmentalized, granting him only enough information to maintain cover without exposing broader Soviet structures. That assessment meant his value diminished with age, but his confinement continued to prevent potential contact with residual channels. In 1991, as the Soviet Union unraveled, federal officials conducted a reassessment of dormant cases. Fisher's record resurfaced for the first time in years. A review team examined his file in a room that smelled of ozone from nearby photocopiers, spreading documents across a long table beneath dim overhead bulbs. They noted the absence of external attempts to locate him, an indication that whatever network had once supported him had collapsed long before the USSR itself. With geopolitical priorities shifting, the team recommended quiet release under strict conditions. Fisher left custody in the spring of 1993. He stepped into a world transformed by technology, economic shifts, and the collapse of the system he had once served. The relocation program assigned him a new identity in a small Midwestern town where his past remained inaccessible by design. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and habitually punctual on his evening walks along streets lined with aging maples. He rented a modest apartment that smelled faintly of old carpet and newsprint, living with the quiet precision that had defined him decades earlier. McKee passed away in 1997. His obituary mentioned his contributions to political science, his mentorship to students, and his dedication to teaching, but made no reference to the extraordinary discovery that had intersected his career. The envelope that began the entire chain of events remained sealed in a federal storage vault, awaiting future declassification. Fisher died in 2004 from heart complications. His belongings filled a single cardboard box, a few books, a pair of worn shoes, and a map of Europe folded with careful symmetry. No one in his town knew the significance of the items or the past they represented. Only the classified record preserved the truth, buried deeper each year beneath layers of Cold War history that continued to unfold long after the lives involved had already ended. 2 decades after Fisher's death, the archival building holding his case file still carried the same muted smell of dust, dry paper, and aging fluorescent wiring. Researchers passing through its dim corridors often brushed against metal cabinets that vibrated softly whenever the heating system switched on. Among hundreds of Cold War documents stored in these drawers, Fisher's folder remained sealed beneath a thick stack of declassification requests. Each request had been postponed, delayed by shifting priorities, or denied due to lingering security restrictions that traced back to forgotten bureaucratic decisions. When the folder finally reached a review analyst in 2019, the man opened it beneath a lamp that cast a narrow cone of yellow light over the table. The crackle of brittle pages broke the quiet, releasing a faint chemical odor from old photographic negatives. The analyst studied the case with a detached professionalism, yet he paused when he reached the earliest notes, McKee's handwriting, still clear after so many years. The simplicity of the situation startled him. A professor's question, a student's hesitation, and a chain of events cascading with relentless precision through the machinery of national security. In academic circles, the incident resurfaced only as a footnote in a broader study on Cold War infiltration strategies. Historians traced how intelligence agencies monitored universities during that era, noting how easily skilled operatives could hide inside institutions that valued openness and inquiry. Fisher's story became a quiet example of the vulnerability inherent in environments built on trust. Scholars emphasized the tension between academic freedom and national protection, a conflict that had never fully disappeared even after the Cold War ended. Within federal agencies, the case became part of a training module used for orienting new counterintelligence officers. The presentation room smelled faintly of dry carpet and warm electronics, and the overhead projector cast grainy slides showing anonymized details from Fisher's notes. Recruits learned how small anomalies, unexpected data, inconsistent background stories, subtle behavioral shifts could signal deeper threats. When they asked about the outcome, instructors offered only sanitized summaries, avoiding personal details while stressing the importance of vigilance in seemingly ordinary settings. McKee's role remained largely unknown to the public. His actions were never officially acknowledged, but traces of his involvement lingered in internal memos, stored under separate classification tags. His decision had altered the trajectory of multiple agencies' surveillance policies, influencing how federal officials interacted with universities for decades. Yet his name rarely appeared in those policy documents, absorbed into the anonymous machinery that governments rely on during periods of ideological conflict. The case also exposed the emotional cost embedded within intelligence work. Fisher's quiet disappearance from campus, the severed connections, and the lingering uncertainty left behind reflected the human toll of clandestine operations. Even after his release, he lived a life shaped by isolation, dislocation, and the collapse of everything he had once believed in. The residue of his earlier choices clung to him until the end, forming a shadowed legacy that existed only in classified records and half-forgotten surveillance reports. When the analyst closed the folder and returned it to storage, he noted how thin the file looked despite the decades of consequences it represented. The Cold War had created countless stories like this, small events unfolding into wider patterns of suspicion, secrecy, and irreversible decisions. Fisher's case was neither exceptional nor trivial. It occupied the space between, demonstrating how ideology and routine could collide inside a single, unremarkable room. Outside the archive, evening light stretched across the pavement in long orange bands, settling slowly into darkness. The buildings around the complex stood silent, their windows reflecting the fading sky. History, as always, remained mostly hidden, layered beneath decisions made quietly, documented sparsely, and remembered only through fragments preserved in paper and ink. And long after those fragments fade, the consequences continue their slow, unbroken drift through time.